Javier, I can't believe it. Everything that needed to be said about cults has been said. I feel so empty inside.
Wait a minute, Rebecca. I'm not sure that's true. Have you ever thought about how cults kind of operate like businesses?
Yeah, like businesses, cults operate like a startup, then mature into larger organizations and sometimes become institutions, or they go under.
What if we explored the business of cults and what happens once the leader dies or leaves?
You mean leaves for prison?
Yeah, and in some cases, even worse.
I like it. Go on.
We can expose the leaders as the con artists they are, which, it's kind of my thing.
Yes, and we can interview experts on cults to help us understand this analogy, which is kind of my thing.
Exactly, and it allows us to keep investigating cults, which is totally
our thing.
Join me, Javier Leyva, from the Pretend Podcast.
And me, Rebecca Sebastian, from Dialogue Podcast. The Business of Cults drops the week of February 7th on both the Pretend Podcast and Dialogue feeds. I am so happy the cult conversation isn't over. Big content warning today. Our conversation covers information about pedophilia, sexual abuse, and child pornography. The conversation is educational in tone and it is not explicit, but the subject matter is intense, so please take care while listening or feel free to skip if it might be triggering. Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I'm your host, Rebecca Sebastian, and I am very eager and excited to share today's episode with you. But first, I want to talk about the trailer you just heard, which is called The Business of Cults. It's a 3-part crossover collaboration series with my friend Javier Leyva of the Pretend Podcast. Pretend is a great show, and Javier covers cons and scams, but he's also really interested in cults. You might know, if you've been around here for longer than a few episodes, that I also enjoy a good cult conversation. So we teamed up to talk about and explore the idea of cults as businesses and businesses as cults. And you won't just be hearing from me and Javier. We're bringing in experts, former cult members, including Sarah Edmondson, Dr. Yanya Lalich, Rick Allen Ross, Amanda Montel, and it is going to be amazing. So for the next 3 weeks, that's what you'll be hearing on Dialogue. Each week is a new episode under the series, The Business of Cults. So I would love for you to share these upcoming episodes on social media. Let's try to get a little culty buzz going around it. I've already shared some on my Dialogue feed, which you can follow at Dialogue Pod on Instagram. And you can also find me on Twitter and Facebook at the same handle. Again, that drops next week, February 9th, and it'll be a 3-part series. Now, today we have just as much to be excited about because my guests are no strangers to this podcast Dialogue. They've both appeared on the show together and separately on Patreon episodes, and they're my real-life true crime besties, Dr. Shiloh and Dr. Scott, the forensic psychologists and hosts of the podcast LA Not So Confidential, which, if you don't already listen to, please go subscribe or follow wherever you listen to podcasts, and you will learn so much. Honestly, it's a go-to resource for me in the true crime world, and they're back. Now, I specifically brought them on because I watched the 2nd season of Cheer, like many of you did, on Netflix, and I loved it. But it was so different from season 1, and if you haven't watched either, I highly recommend both seasons. But if you did, you know why season 2 was so different. I'm going to give a quick snapshot of the story so you can understand why I am covering a cheerleading documentary on my true crime podcast. So for anybody who hasn't watched, this is a docuseries on Netflix that follows a junior college competitive level cheer team at Navarro College in Texas. And we meet Coach Monica, who is a coach to her team, but she is in so many ways much, much more than that. Very much like a parent figure. And it follows the lives of several of these central figures of the team. And the big arc of the story is going to the Nationals at Daytona Beach, Florida, which happens on spring break. So in season 1, we had this incredibly uplifting, moving, high energy COVID escape series. And now it did have stories with a lot of gravity and emotion because a lot of the kids on the team came from difficult backgrounds, and they really escaped their lives through this competitive level cheer. But Cheer Season 2 came out, and something happened between Season 1 and Season 2. One of the most beloved figures of Cheer Season 1, a student named Jerry, was sued by a family for sexual abuse. He was then subsequently arrested and charged by the FBI on child pornography charges, and then they filed additional charges of sexual exploitation of children, receiving child pornography, traveling with the attempt to engage in sexual conduct with a minor, and enticement. He's in federal prison now awaiting trial, and he has pleaded not guilty on all charges. So Season 2 just dropped a few weeks ago, and like many people, I watched with a lot of anticipation. Now, I know this is a longer intro than usual, but I really need to emphasize a couple things. My conversation with Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh moved very heavily in the direction of processing grief and the complex emotions and cognitive dissonance that occur after learning someone you love and thought you knew might have committed a crime. So we spend less time talking about the victim's story, but I want to be so clear that I applaud these boys who came forward, and their appearance in the doc was so incredibly brave. And I know I speak for both Dr. Shiloh and Dr. Scott when I say that. Their story is so important as survivors of abuse, but I also wanted to create a safe space to explore these complicated emotions and reactions to Jerry as a perpetrator. And that was my intention with the interview. I just really want to make that clear so that it doesn't feel like an oversight in the conversation. Also, a note that all Jerry's crimes are alleged at this point in the pretrial phase, and we do our best to say so throughout the conversation, but we might miss it once or twice. So please keep in mind he is innocent until proven guilty. Because this is a bit of a heavy topic, and Cheer has some amazing, exhilarating moments, it isn't all just crime and darkness. Stick around for the end of the episode where I include my very favorite scene, which I will time code in the show notes. It's Season 2, Episode 4 at the very end, and it's this beautiful montage of the two competitive cheer teams doing their full-out routine in preparation for nationals. It's seriously just one of my all-time favorite scenes in a documentary. I think the cinematography is so stunning. So I think if you need a little pick-me-up at the end of this conversation, stick around to the very end and you will hear it there. Thank you, Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh, for killing the small talk. It's so good to see you both. Welcome.
Thank you. See you. It's really exciting to be back. It's good to see you. Yeah, we actually get to see you.
Yeah, it is. It's always great to have you. Well, let me just say this. We need to talk about Jerry and Cheer Season 2. And I brought both of you in specifically to have this conversation with me because I need to talk about it. And I think a lot of people are feeling that way. And I chose both of you specifically because of your background and expertise. So maybe Dr. Scott and Dr. Shelley, you could each take a moment and talk about what that is, and then we'll get right into it.
Sounds good. So I'm a former law enforcement officer. First off, I worked patrol my entire career. I was not a detective. However, I had a pretty intense interest in sexually motivated crimes, went to every training I could in that capacity that was available to me as a police officer, as well as whenever those calls came out, nobody else really wanted to handle them usually. And I volunteered as much as I could to try and get the experience as that very first responder. So that's where the early interest started. Going through school and becoming a forensic psychologist, I started working with offenders who had perpetrated sexual crimes in 2006 as a student. And that was in an internship setting where I did group therapy, individual therapy, and started to get my feet wet with a little bit of risk assessment for future sexual crimes. And I was working very closely with probation and parole in that capacity. I worked with high-risk sex offenders. I worked with pretrial offenders, people who are being prosecuted for sexual offenses, and working with them before they even went to prison. And then for a few years, I worked with an exclusively federal caseload. So this was majority online offenders, child pornography charges, solicitation charges, some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. And then I also have done some consulting work on the side. So doing some assessments or reports as an expert opinion in this realm on a variety of cases where sexual offending or abnormal sexual behavior comes up. And I have consulted with a number of entities, from private schools who have a concern about a staff member to law enforcement agencies who think one of their own is doing something in this realm. I do still see a couple of these clients, and we'll probably be moving into closing that actually this year, but staying in a consultant role.
Wow. Okay. This is great to have your insight. And Dr. Scott, how about you?
So Shiloh's experience is much more extensive than mine. However, where we met was at our psych internship at a forensic site with the pre and post incarceration individuals who were caught for primarily image offenses for the pretrial, the post incarceration, like long-term or life management of parolees with these types of crimes. We would provide individual and group therapy services. I didn't come from law enforcement. I came from entertainment. So I think that there, in this particular conversation that we're having tonight, my particular experience is that I worked in entertainment and I was a professional dancer for 15 years. And, there is a bit of a crossover in that world of performing and the intensity with which you train for a relatively short career. And there are certain psychological issues that come along with that. And also kind of an overarching idea of why people become performers.
Okay, let's start with when I first reached out to Shiloh, I said, Jerry is an outlier in terms of an offender, and I'm having a hard time reconciling what I thought to be true about him and how I feel about this. And then she challenged that and said he actually isn't. So I'd really like to start with the idea of the sex offender profile, and in what ways are we still stuck in some archaic way of thinking about this? That's a stereotype. In what ways is Jerry very much an average offender? Why Jerry? How is this possible?
That's a great question. And, you talked about where does he fit in terms of a sex offender profile? And interestingly, opposed to what we might have thought 20, 30 years ago, there really isn't a sex offender profile. And especially in terms of demographics, right? And I think Scott can tell you that, once he and I were in the work, we could sit in a group and look around, and it was incredibly diverse. I mean, people that you would look at and go, oh, that's the guy I went to college with. Oh, that guy could be my uncle. Demographically, very, very diverse. I think that comes from the internet not being a luxury at a certain point in time. It was something that was reachable by everybody. Once it's on your phone, once it's in your household, internet crimes of a sexual nature skyrocketed. Like thousands of percentage wise over again. We just saw them, like the FBI, who generally has jurisdiction over anything internet based, could not keep up with the cases that were coming in. So when we look at the common traits that sex offenders have, they are usually behavioral and they're usually situational because they're not demographics. There's some static factors like being male, being under the age of 34, which you can argue that age isn't static because you do age, but at a moment in time, there's sort of younger and then there's older. If a person has ever lived with a romantic partner before, if they have a criminal history, those things all put them at higher risk for continuing to offend. And then there's some dynamic factors, things that can change. Who are their social influences? Do they have intimacy deficits that they can kind of learn how to overcome? What's their general just self-regulation, impulsivity like? What's their sexual self-regulation like? Those are things that are changeable for the better or for the worse. And those are what we look at when we try and look at common behaviors and common situations for people who offend sexually. And the reason that the whole purpose we do that is to try and predict risk level for those who have been caught. Who do we know who's dangerous and who isn't? Because a lot more sexual offenses happen because of opportunity and situation rather than true deviant sexual interests, which is, I think, what a lot of people kind of go to automatically in their mind is like, oh my God, this must be, somebody who is a rapist or somebody who is a pedophile. And overwhelmingly, those are the rarer cases.
I would also add into this conversation that while we're talking about an incredibly uncomfortable phenomenon, that there is not necessarily a gray area, but there's a spectrum of attraction to underage individuals that has to be recognized in this, because it dovetails perfectly into what Dr. Shiloh was talking about with opportunity.
Right.
And what Jerry is accused of doing, would one place themselves in that environment in order to take advantage of others?
Which is more predatory, right?
Which is more predatory. And that does happen. And those are, we talk about, we'll even give some examples later of people who are older coaches that sought this out, doctors that seek out these opportunities. Or was this like a really tragic nexus of a need for control, a need for power, and some other characteristics that met in opportunity? But that being said, what I saw in Jerry in that first season is a lot of immaturity. Like, yeah, the Matt talks were super energetic, but you also saw him turn on and off. The camera would catch him super, super animated and positive, and then a blank face. So that to me is significant when I look. I'm not going to say what it is, but it's just something that I would say is notable. I thought in moments he could be very childlike. He could be impulsive. He could be secretive. He could be demanding. And those get exampled in the evidence in season 2 of his grooming behaviors and his willingness to use a power differential with his victims. And I think that is super, super significant here when we look at all of those data points when in a situation like this.
So given all those factors of this like overarching rubric, but also these specific scenario, I really like this distinction you're both talking about is like opportunity versus seeking out something versus becoming aware of a power that maybe has developed, especially with the notoriety of the show and all of that. He was only 19 during this time period, which is technically an adult, which is what makes a lot of this illegal. And the alleged victims were 14. So where do you bring that in? They're all teenagers.
Yeah, I think actually he first started communicating with them, as they talk about in the documentary, when they were 13.
Okay.
And I really hone in on that number. We're talking about arbitrary numbers here in a sense, and laws that surround ages of consent, other, sort of age laws, drinking and things like that, are trying to do a lot of things, right? They're trying to account for someone's maturity level, their emotionality, their cognitive functioning. And when we talk about consent, most states in the United States kind of land on a number. And actually the majority of states, it's the age of consent is 16. California, it's 18, which is, I think there's only 4 states where it's 18. That's actually the rarer. It's either 16, 17, or 18. But why do we pick that number? It's just like at some point we kind of feel like, okay, people can make their own decisions.
Now you're ready. Yeah.
Yeah. Now you're ready. Or you could be.
There's so much controversy. I mean, this has been going on for years. I mean, this is not necessarily related to sex offenses, but the idea that, and I'm old enough to where the drinking age when I was growing up was 18. Mm-hmm. And then because of the influence of MAD, and I have a lot of thoughts about that, but they raise the drinking age across the board to 21, and yet we still can allow 18-year-olds to sign for FAFSA loans of $150,000 to $250,000 to pay for college. And because they're old enough to do that, but they're supposedly don't have enough cognitive functioning to decide whether or not they're going to drink, or we're allowing them to sign up for military service at age 18 and go and serve their country. So that's another facet of that arbitrary age thing that, like Shiloh's saying, is I guess at some point they go, well, we got to figure something out.
Right. Where you can have an incredibly mature, person who's younger than 18. You can have an 18-year-old that is not ready. Does it change anything about the crime? No, absolutely not. He is an adult, although a developing adult, right? Because 19 for a male, you still have a lot of brain development that has areas that are responsible for impulsivity, that are responsible for decision-making and weighing consequences, and a lot of that executive functioning. But what I want to go back to what Dr. Scott was saying earlier was this power differential. And we term that in this area of research and treatment as power bases. Maybe that's appropriate since they talk about being a base in cheer, right?
Pyramids, yeah.
So a power base would be anything where it differentiates the power so that a person feels more like a victim and someone is definitely more of a perpetrator. So what we see in this case is absolutely the power base of celebrity and status. We see that across the board with a lot of celebrity cases, right? Why people don't come forward, that's a lot of people's questions. When you have somebody like these survivors, these boys have talked about, they knew they were going to lose all of their friends. They knew their social life would be done. They knew the world of cheer in which they knew it before was never going to be the same. That's a lot to weigh, to keep your mouth shut, either just with your family or to go public and file charges. But also we see age. Age is absolutely a power base. Size and strength is a power base. If someone is bigger than you, it's something I had to think about as a police officer. I might have, a gun on my belt, but as a 5'5" female, I got to pick and choose how I handle situations. And then surprise, the element of surprise is also a power base. So if you can see someone coming at you and running at you, you might be able to do a little bit something. But if they jump out from behind a bush, the moment you walk by them, you are completely off guard. So every power base that gets stacked up makes somebody feel more vulnerable. And I think we just kind of equate them more as a victim, and perpetrators can absolutely manipulate this and use this on purpose.
Absolutely. Shiloh, can you talk about how this makes it more serious, the combination of what he did? Because it's a layering effect. If it was only images, it would be viewed very differently from our psych perspective. Can you speak more to that?
Right. So regarding Jerry's alleged offenses here, so soliciting nude images pretty much via social media, from what we know, possession of such images, distributing those images even of himself, and then there's in-person assault, right? Mm-hmm. So it is more rare and more serious for online sexual behavior to then cross over to real life. So the majority of people who have criminal offenses that are, let's say, possession of child pornography, and I use that term as a legal term as charges. In the research and treatment field, we say child sexual abuse images, as to not make it sound like a product. Mm-hmm. But charges, legally, it would be possession of child pornography. Those types of cases definitely have very low recidivism rates, and people generally don't cross over into crimes where they're acting out in real life. Now we see both, and it is considered more predatory and more serious and higher risk for future offenses, especially when there's no intervention.
And the thing I'd want to talk about there that's going to play further down when we start talking about the charges, Rebecca, is that the FBI does not swoop down on CSI, on child endangerment sex images, unless they have a case. If the FBI show up with a team, you're done. Like we just know this because we worked in this. It's like if somebody had 1 to almost maybe 99 images, the feds don't really have time to look at it. And I'm not justifying, hey, go out and get your 99 images by any means. That's would not be appropriate at all. But unfortunately, it's so ubiquitous as a crime now that they are overloaded. So we're also talking, Shiloh and I worked with individuals who would have collected tens of thousands of images. So that is a real indicator that the FBI showing up with this solid case that I don't really necessarily understand what their defense is going to be able to do.
Well, that was one of my questions.
This is for real.
He's pleading not guilty so far, which I can't imagine is helping him. And I imagine is keeping him in prison longer because they're going to trial.
But it's also buying time.
It is buying time. And I consulted with our lovely attorney, Michelle, because I wanted to make sure that I was saying that correctly, is that, he is facing, everybody's saying 15 years. 15 years is the bare minimum of what he could do for these charges. He could actually be adjudicated with a much, much longer term, way more serious. So the general response for defense is going to say not guilty so that they can then get into the conversation, the action, and the bargaining to see if they can get some of it down.
And the feds have a 98% conviction rate. So
I know. I mean,
they're notorious for overworking a case, like Scott is saying. Digital evidence is very difficult to defend. I mean, it is. It's there. It's the most perfect evidence you have is to say, we're charging you for possession of a picture, and here is that picture in your possession right here.
Even if there's not necessarily all of the images, I mean, it's not just the physical presence or the virtual presence of that particular image. The FBI is tracking all of this.
Right. So I think this is probably also a good point to define pedophilia, because I think that might be on the forefront of some of your listeners' minds. Like, what about pedophiles? What about people who are truly attracted to prepubescent children? We know that doesn't change. That is something that we know now with the brain research and the other biological markers that we're looking at in terms of people who have pedophilic disorder, that this is unchangeable. This is how they're hardwired. But the key in the definition there is prepubescent children is the age range. I hate to say age range. It's more of a stage of development that the victim is in. And what we're hearing in this case is, so far, the information you and I have, right, is that the youngest is when he made contact with these boys when they were 13. Now, that's kind of a wobbler, because you could have a very developed 13-year-old, you could have an underdeveloped 13-year-old. But what I would be looking for if I were doing some sort of assessment and diagnosis here is who and what body characteristics is the person attracted to? Does the victim have secondary sex characteristics where they have gone through puberty? And if so, and if I can establish that, then I would not diagnose someone as a pedophile. Child molesters can be offenders that are not pedophiles. And some pedophiles don't ever go on to offend. So those things aren't mutually interchangeable. But I thought that was just probably a good point to sort of lay that out for your audience.
We'll be right back after a quick break, and we'll explore some of the reactions of Jerry's teammates and his coach, Monica. So what do you make of Monica and Gabby getting critiqued for their response on a friend level and just a human who's reckoning with this news?
We have an orientation within the field of psychology called object relations. And on the most base level description of object relations, it's the idea that you and I, Bex, you and I have been friends for several years now. And I know you professionally, I know you personally. And we've also had some real heartfelt difficult conversations about struggling through COVID and family stuff and big life choices. Like you and I have a relationship. So I have an idea of who you are internalized, literally, well, not literally, virtually inside me. And it's like, there's a little Rebecca that is inside my head, and I have a relationship with her and I have dialogues with her. And that relationship I have with Rebecca inside me may not be actually accurate and representative of who you are, because you have your own life and your own accomplishments and challenges and shadow selves and archetypes that I'm not privy to. And maybe even after a 30-year friendship, I would still not be privy to them. That's just the way life is. So bringing that back and folding it around to cheer is, I thought it was incredibly heartbreaking and beautiful and empathic of Gabby and Monica to share how devastated they were because they were losing that relationship they have, which was not representative of everything Jerry is.
Right.
And so I'm talking about something that requires us to have critical thinking about compassion and empathy. And it goes back, I mean, if people are coming from a faith-based issue, is like, am I going to judge the person on a terrible mistake and a terrible thing they've done versus all of the other things that they are? I mean, legally, it's very clear here. Like this legal train is not going to stop. But when you think about, I think that there are probably a lot of people out there that have friends or family members that have made terrible mistakes, and you have to sit with it. We have to sit in what I would say is the real gray area of distress tolerance and realize that, like, I had these really good things from this person, and here's something terrible that he's done. It's just a hard thing. People defend themselves with the idea that they're all or mostly good, when in reality, we all have, to an extent, really some dark impulses or thoughts. The vast majority of the time, our internal moral code nudges or shoves our thoughts and behaviors right back in line. But I'll say this, like the ones that are so viciously accusatory in these situations, particularly against people like Monica, like Gabby, who are secondary to the perpetrator, those accusers are terrified by the reflection of their shadow selves in Jerry.
Ooh.
And they're taking it out on people like Monica and Gabby, who are being authentic and present and sharing their pain.
Wow. So it's very much like the antithesis of, what's the expression there, but before the grace of God go I. Like, I leave with that. You know what I mean? I just leave a lot of room for what you're talking about in terms of the wide range of human capability, what's inside all of us in different situations. And also that expressing one thing, grief over the loss of a friendship with Jerry, or even grieving over who you thought he was, and can no longer be, it's grief.
Yeah.
That it doesn't also diminish outrage and horror for what the victims went through. Like, it doesn't have to be this one or the other and only one is okay. And it's that all or nothing thinking that is so pervasive on the internet and social media. There's none of this nuance. There's none of what you're talking about. The critical thinking and sitting in the gray and saying, of course, Gabby and Monica are heartbroken for both parties, that, and themselves. Like, it's so frustrating to me. And I think that's what got me so hard in this second season was grappling with all of that.
Yeah. It's heartbreaking. I mean, it's heartbreaking
for everybody. I mean, you have watched the survivors share their story, their mother and her journey of how to protect her kids.
And the bravery it took
for
them to come forward. I mean, I'm just astounded by it. Those twins are so brave to be able to say something very difficult and frank about what they engaged in. Consider the victims, consider it. I want to be careful about saying believe, because in my situation working with law enforcement, I do see false accusations, and false accusations coming intentionally and false accusations coming because of an individual's mental health status. But we need to consider, we need to listen, we need to support and explore that without minimizing what the victim is saying. And I couldn't believe that the mom of the twins held it together as well as she did. I just think it takes such bravery.
It really, really does. It was remarkable, and how poised and just, they were just so resolved that they were
Right.
doing this. And
Right.
it was quite amazing considering their age. Another interesting aspect to this is that in season 1, we learned that Jerry had a very difficult childhood. How likely is it that this is in Jerry's history? Is that a mistake that we make to think it must have happened to them as children?
You are hitting on something that is a prominent, recurrent assumption that really needs to be dismantled about sex offenders, that something must have happened to them in order for this to have happened.
The research now reflects that only about a third of sexual offenders have had a sexual abuse history of their own. It's actually much lower than we thought it was for many years, because it was a very easy excuse to come into treatment with or come into court with and say, I am this way because I have this in my history. Interestingly, once we started implementing the polygraph into sex offender treatment and monitoring by probation and parole, and implementing this into sort of an initial history when they come into treatment, would this even matter if it was part of Jerry's past or not? It definitely matters, right? Because it can shape unhealthy relationships with sex, boundaries, worth, love, all of these things that absolutely could contribute to their offending behavior. But at the end of the day, there are far more sexual abuse survivors that do not go on to offend, and we can't lose sight of that.
Mm-hmm. Now, Ladarius does share in season 1 that he was a victim of sexual assault and abuse as a child. And his response in season 2 is another one that really got me, because he expressed anger.
A situation like Ladarius would be gravely wounded by this loss. So go back to that idea of the internalized object. So he has lost his friend, his rival, his competitor, and his brother. At the end of the day, those were all 4 of these things, and they had each other's back, right? The grief for losing that is incredible. And on top of it, his containment, his parental mentor, safe place is Monica.
Yeah.
And Monica, look, she made a choice, a career choice that I actually applaud. I mean, the Dancing with the Stars thing was a big deal. Why shouldn't she have that opportunity?
Mm-hmm.
You know, a person in Ladarius's situation could feel abandoned by that.
Sure.
So abandonment, loss, grief, anger.
It is so complex. And, this really had me thinking a lot, because even as a treatment provider, I have people come at me and say, how could you do that? How could you work with those people? And I know I've said this a lot, but I don't know how I can, but I can. And I feel like there has to be someone out there that does. I thought that the reactions were incredibly transparent, and I thought it captured all of them. I saw grief, I saw betrayal, I saw confusion, I saw denial, all of these things that are absolutely normal, no matter how you are experiencing a loss of a friend in your life. So it was just a great snapshot of grief. I also want to be cognizant of people who are out there who are having strong reactions, who might be victims themselves, and that's okay too. It might be very triggering to hear that when you do feel like it is an all or nothing situation. I think as a society, we need to get out of a lot of all or nothing thinking. It's living in that uncomfortable gray area that's so important. And yes, it's much easier to label someone as horrible and sort of tuck it away and put it up on a shelf, rather than sitting with good people do bad things. And I would have hoped that it prompted more of that type of thinking and reflection. But I know anybody can sort of, sit behind their social media accounts and roast people for their experiences. But it seemed very incredibly vulnerable, and it was really, really powerful in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. What would you tell a person if they're in a situation, like if they're Monica or that parent?
The first thing I would say to somebody in Monica's position is, you're an amazing person and you are not responsible for this. especially look in this particular situation where we are witnessing to it. I don't look at if someone's being brought up in a home and a child perpetrates, and in their nuclear family household, they're found to have images, or they perpetrate upon a neighbor or a sibling or something. That's a different conversation to have with a parent. Like, were you aware of this? Did you see signs? What could have been done? And even then, it could be completely obfuscated by the perpetrator's attempts to keep it secretive. In a situation like this, I would say to Monica, you probably didn't miss anything because it was very secretive and very hidden. And now you have to mourn that relationship is irrevocably changed. I'm not saying there can't be a new relationship, and Monica even exemplified it beautifully by communicating with him. And she was a little bit taken aback, as I would have been, by the unrealistic, over-optimistic response that Jerry had.
Would you characterize Jerry's response in what she relays as the communications between them as denial, this over-optimism?
Yeah, it is denial, and it is this over-optimization. It's a defense mechanism. I've taken care of myself this whole time. I'm going to keep taking care of myself. I'm going to tell everybody I'm going to be a motivational speaker. It's just not very realistic. It does not show us that he has a realistic view of what's actually going on.
Yeah. I don't want to rule that out. Like, I love the idea of a massive redemption story way down the line for Jerry to heal and rehabilitate and come out on the other side. I leave a lot of room for that. And I know it might not be realistic, and you might be looking at me right now like, okay,
no,
Rebecca,
no, I'm not.
But it's premature. It's obviously premature.
Right. And I pull this line from Wicked all the time because I'm a gay guy that likes Broadway musicals. But, one of the great lines from Wicked is, the most celebrated are the rehabilitated. But what Jerry didn't do was take any culpability, because he can't right now. He's in the trial phase.
Yes.
So the idea that you wouldn't be going, crafting a message that says, this is a really tough time. Hey, Monica, I just want you to know that you were everything to me, and I really appreciate everything you've done. That would have been a more realistic message, and probably more helpful to Monica, rather than this sort of strange defense thing, because nobody wants to hear that either. Like, oh,
I know, it's too soon.
You're going to be a motivational speaker
too soon. Yeah.
I'm not going to let my kids go to that. Right. That's what a lot of people are thinking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this begs the question that I feel like is my $1 million question. And I think other people are wondering, I mean, in your professional opinion, is a full rehabilitation with someone like Jerry in this scenario possible? And I know you haven't evaluated him. He's not your client. You don't have all the information, but given what you know, what do you think?
So I had mentioned previously that online sexual offenses have a very, very low recidivism rate. And if we look at sexual offenses, the big umbrella of all of them all together, it's probably much lower than people think. Although it's hard, we're putting a lot of different types of crimes under this umbrella. But do you have a guess, Rebecca, of what recidivism rates would be for sex offenders in general?
50%?
Yeah, that's a pretty common answer. People say it's actually 15.
Oh.
So it's much lower than we think of because of these offenses. Again, that's an average of all the different types. And if you recall, online offending or child pornography possession is like 1% to 2%. It's very, very low. But we see a variety of alleged behaviors with Jerry. And again, they're concerning because they did cross over from social media and online to real life. So for contact offenders, it's concerning, it's serious. The risk of reoffense is higher, especially when you see certain factors that are certainly present in this case. When offenders have victims who are males, they're actually more likely to reoffend. When they have victims that are unrelated to them, they can be strangers or it can be someone they already know. But if it's not a family member, that makes them more likely to reoffend. And if indeed they were strangers, which we can argue is someone you have an online relationship with, a stranger or not, then that also makes them more likely to reoffend. And the idea behind that, just in, a quick little summary, is that if they are more willing to sort of go out of their comfort zone outside of the home and offend against people that it takes more time and effort and energy and probably isn't as secretive, then that's more risky behavior. The other factor is that younger offenders under the age of 35 tend to reoffend as well. So if we are going to sort of apply this risk assessment to this hypothetical case of Jerry, because these are still alleged crimes and he's in the pretrial phase, we're starting to see some of these risk factors stack up that say, he's going to need some heavy intervention, some heavy treatment programs to make sure he learns how to not reoffend and to look at all the considerations and factors as to why he offended in the first place. And then put together what we call a relapse prevention plan. It kind of comes from the terminology from substance abuse treatment, but really looking at what are his high-risk situations, what are his unique risk factors, and how do you intervene when those things possibly come up again in the future, instead of going to the old behavior, which is the offense.
I did want to say also that I'm kind of horrified and mystified that a program as intense as both Trinity and Navarro doesn't have a sports psychologist on staff or a sports psychotherapist. It doesn't matter if it's a social worker, a psychologist, an MFT, but somebody that is there to deal with some of those issues, because they're intense. They're no less intense than any other type of sports team.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I can't say I feel more optimistic. I feel like I have more clarity, and I feel like I have some nuance that I didn't have when thinking about Jerry specifically, his situation. But I was kind of hoping I would leave like it's going to be okay for him, and I'm not sure.
Is it a possibility? Of course it is. Yes, certainly. It's going to take a lot of good years of specific treatment targeted at identifying the individual's very specific risk factors. And even though there's those static factors, like who his victims were, and that doesn't ever change. It doesn't ever change for the better. Sometimes you get more information, you realize, oh my gosh, this is worse than we knew. But the changeable, those dynamic risk factors that I think I spoke about earlier, those are changeable. They're changeable for the better or for the worse, but that's what treatment targets. We look at those things like impulsiveness. We look at those things like building a good social support system around you, coping skill development, education on what is healthy sexual interactions and regulation like. So there is a lot to work with.
I will say this, I think he's a survivor.
Yeah.
And I don't think necessarily all of his survival skills are the best, but some of them are pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm asking guests this season to define justice, what was I thinking? But I would love to hear, in light of the conversation we had, in light of your life experience, when it's put to you in your own personal narrative and definition, how do you define it?
I think that's the hardest thing you've asked.
I know.
I don't really have a prepared answer. I mean, look, the definition from the dictionary is you do the crime, you do the time, right? Basically, it's like you are held responsible for what you've done. And, I live in a world as a forensic psychologist and as a therapist where I have to look at things differently. And two people can commit the same crime, and yet what is the justice for that? The justice for each of them may be very different. I try and stay in the gray because justice means something differently. Justice is continually evolving, and it needs to evolve because we live in a very complex world. So justice is exploring and applying the appropriate response to people's failures on society and failures to themselves.
Dr. Shiloh, what about you, in your own words, the meaning of justice?
I see justice as actually a process, not an outcome. And I feel like more often it's referred to as an outcome. But for me, I go very concretely to fairness and respect. And I believe that's how the process of justice should be applied and played out. When I look at Lady Justice with her scarf over her eyes, being blinded to whomever is in her courtroom, and whomever is all the players really in the situation, I feel like that's an ongoing process that helps me apply it that way rather than the outcome, because I think looking at justice as an outcome is very, very difficult. And I don't know if there is true justice in that way. So I like to think of it in a more active phase instead of a noun necessarily.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you both, Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh, for killing the small talk today.
Thanks for having us back.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Always.